Hello everyone, and welcome back to our mini-series on comparative poetry. This is video number 4 of that series, and today we'll be analyzing the first poem in our set on that perspectives on death, and that is Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson. So you'll recall the first thing we need to make sure we do in comparative poetry is take a look at both poems and start with the poet and see what is their background and what do I learn about them that might aid me in properly analyzing the text. So the first thing that I do is I take a look at Emily Dickinson, and after doing some research, I figure out that she is an American poet, specifically from Massachusetts, which is in that northeast portion of the United States, and that she lived from 1830 till 1886. Then I need to ask myself, what do they typically write about? And for Emily Dickinson, what she typically wrote about was death and immortality, in that we can account for why she chooses to write about those topics in particular, in part because of her Christian faith. So she would have been very well versed in the Bible, and in fact she would have grown up in the United States in an era where people were very much focused on faith and on Christianity in particular. Additionally, I know that later in life she lived more of a secluded lifestyle, so very reclusive in terms of who she interacted with, which was not very many people, and how she chose to interact with them, primarily through writing letters rather than seeing them face to face, meaning that she had a lot of time to dedicate to her writing and to poetry. So now that I've figured out the background for my poet, Emily Dickinson, the next step that I need to complete is to read through the poem itself. Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves, and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. So the first thing I do then is I'm reading for comprehension. And remember, I'm going to do that by going stanza by stanza and trying to figure out what exactly is my speaker talking about. So I see in this first stanza that my speaker is going on a carriage ride with death, and that their destination is eternity. I look at the second stanza. I then see that the ride is one that's very slow, and the speaker is comfortable with death. So it's not something that's terrifying. Don't think of this grim reaper figure. And in fact, he acts with politeness. I look at that and I understand that because of the word civility, meaning politeness. I'm then going to jump to my third stanza, and here I see that they pass by several different scenes that we might see in ordinary life, depending on where we live and grow up. The first is passing by a school. Then they pass by these fields that are planted with wheat. And then finally seeing that they have ridden all day, that the sun now is beginning to set. I then turn to, again, looking at this second set, so my fourth stanza, and I see that here there's a shift, and the speaker begins to become cold because she tells us that she's not properly dressed for the ride that they're on. So she's wearing something called a tippet, which would be a long cape and scarf, and it's made out of this material, like tulle, for example, that is very thin and not something you would want to wear if you're taking a carriage ride out, especially after the sun is set. Look then to stanza number 5, and I see now that they're passing by a house that the speaker describes as strange. And one of the things that's interesting about it is that it has this cornice around the outside. And cornice simply being this ornamental molding. And I finally come to stanza 6, and this is where all of those little details and hints finally piece themselves together. So I see that from the very beginning of my poem, my speaker has already been dead. And she's talking about the first or the last journey that she made in life, which was a journey with death into eternity. So the next thing that I need to do then is to read in terms of analysis. And you'll see that for two of the verses on the screen in particular, I've gone ahead and begun the Scansian process for you. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But the first thing I want to make sure we're paying attention to as we analyze is the rhyme scheme. So meaning the last word in each verse, is there a rhyming pattern that exists? And I see in fact that there is. And this rhyme pattern that we're going to be looking at is specifically A, B, C, B. So the second and the fourth lines in every single stanza, in particular these quatrains, is going to rhyme with one another, and at times this rhyme is going to be created with what we call slant rhyme, meaning it's not a perfect rhyme, but the way in which it sounds is close enough that they rhyme with one another. And here we know that Dickinson is doing this in particular to draw our attention to that word that creates that slant rhyme. So here in the first quatrain, I need to be paying particular attention to the word immortality, as it creates that slant rhyme with the word me in line 2. The next thing I do then is look at my meter. And on the whole, we're going to see a meter that is created using iambic feet. And you'll recall when we do our discussion of meter, we're not looking at just the type of foot that is created, but also how many feet exist within that particular line. And here we see that in this first verse, Emily Dickinson creates iambic tetrameter, meaning that there are 4 iambic feet in that verse. But interestingly enough, she's going to switch back and forth in these particular quatrains here on this slide between iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter, meaning that verses are going to contain either 8 or 6 syllables, with an iambic foot being made up of 2 of those syllables per foot. The next thing I need to look at then in terms of my analysis is personification. And the big thing that I see here is that death is personified throughout the entire poem. And here in the beginning, death is described not as someone who is scary, but someone who is kind. The next thing I notice is this use of metaphor. So Dickinson is using either ideas or common objects to help make a comparison. So here, this idea of a carriage being compared to eventually the tomb, so your resting place, right? Because we know, since we've gone through the whole entire poem, that from the very beginning, my speaker is speaking from a point of already having succumbed to death. Immortality, then, being that reference to the afterlife, to eternity. The next thing I want to draw your attention to is something new, and this is a literary device called a caesura. And these are dashes that are used to note a pause. You should have noticed while I was reading through the poem that any time I got to this dash, this caesura, I took an extended pause. And here Emily Dickinson is creating this pause because just as we see in this second quatrain we're about to get to in a moment, her ride with death is a slow one. Hence, as we work our way through the poem itself, we shouldn't be hasty in getting to the end. Then I'm going to jump to my next quatrain and repeat that process. And I'm going to ask myself, do I see a continuing of that rhyme scheme? Because remember, any departure away from rhyme scheme or a meter that's established in the poem is the poet taking this huge highlighter and drawing your attention to it. So I look at this quatrain and I see again that it follows this same rhyme scheme, but also it follows that slant rhyme. So away and civility are a slant rhyme with one another. So again, I need to note that word civility. And this is being used to describe death, again, as a figure who is kind and polite. The next thing I do is check to see if my meter is still the same, and I see that it is. This time though, I'm highlighting for you that verse where we see not iambic tetrameter, but iambic trimeter, so those 3 iambic feet. I again see this personification of death continuing, but here the personification is given so I can better understand his character. So death is not someone who rushes. It takes its time, but also death is someone who's polite, someone who has civility about them. So we begin to see this perspective on death emerging just even in the first 2 quatrains because of the way Dickinson personifies him. The next thing that I do then again is to note those pauses that I see. And this is particularly important again because we need to be on that slow ride to death along with our speaker. The last thing I see then is imagery. And I notice that my speaker's daily habits have begun to change. She admits that she puts aside her labor or her work and her leisure, so the things that she does for fun, she puts those things away, and instead she goes along on this ride with death. But I hope that you've noted until now that she never actively makes a choice to go on this ride willingly. In fact, she arrives in the carriage because of the will of death. So she's putting aside these things not necessarily because she wants to, right? She says that she has to put them away. And this helps create that image too of, although death is slow, polite, civil, it also has more control over our life and its timing than we do. I then come to my last quatrain on this slide, and I see here that, yes, my rhyme scheme is continuing, and I have that slant rhyme going on, ring, sun. So it's not so much that the words rhyme with one another, but again, we have that assonance being used to make that rhyme seem stronger, right? That ring, sun, that I vowel sound being repeated here. I also see that my rhythm, again, is continuing. So far, it's contained the same structure as before. So iambic tetrameter or iambic trimeter. But here I see that a new literary device is being used, and that is repetition. So here, imagine that we are in this carriage with our speaker, and we start to see all of these things pass them by. We see that this school passes them by, where these children are striving at something that we're going to talk about in a moment. They pass by these fields of gazing grain, so this field where wheat is being produced for sustenance, for food. And then finally, she says they pass the setting sun. And we're going to jump back to that in a moment. So this repetition of their coming along their journey. But in order to understand this repetition and why it's being used, I need to understand the greater metaphors that Dickinson is making. So here in the beginning, we talked about these children striving for something. And she says they're striving at recess. So striving when they're at play, and then striving in the ring. And these are both metaphors for different places we find ourselves in life. So we're constantly striving either to attain pleasure through leisurely activities, or to attain status and progress in this ring of life. Then we see this continuing. So she then passes by these fields of gazing grain, and these representing, right, how people would plant and harvest to sustain themselves physically. So she's passing by first childhood, those early days of life, then passing by the very thing that man needs to survive, right? Food. And then finally coming to this symbol now of the setting sun. And her passing by this is very important because we're going to see a drastic shift after this point. And we're going to note that the setting sun here symbolizes the coming of death, the close of life. Now we've come to that shift, and I've placed this in blue text rather than white to really highlight for you the change that's being made. And so here I'm going to analyze that my rhythm has gotten all kinds of crazy. So I've thrown iambic out the window, right? So I'm focusing not on that unstressed stress pattern, but my patterns are all over the place, right? And I've bolded those syllables for you where we see the stress being made. And as you're following along, right, it's completely different to what it was before. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet, only tulle. So you should feel in yourself as you read that, well, wait, there's this shift, and suddenly that inner rhythm that Dickinson has created doesn't feel quite right. And she's doing this on purpose, right? You'll also note that the rhyme scheme has gone out the window. Us and gown. There has no sense of this rhyme scheme that might be taking place. Chill, tulle, again, none of these words rhyme with one another. And this is important because now we're coming to not only symbolism for death, but getting this broader image of our speaker working her way towards death. And we see that in the way she is dressed. So here we see that she's describing her clothes. By the way, this is how we know the speaker is in fact a she, right? You wouldn't see men wearing gowns or tulles, okay? And she's dressed as if to go out on a summer's day or to stay at home in the warmth by the fire. So death and the chill of death is going to catch her entirely off guard. We see that being displayed here. And in fact, something else that is rather interesting, in this very first verse at the top of the screen, the speaker says that, or rather, he passed us, meaning the setting sun is passing them, our carriage riders, towards death. And this is interesting because we know, and Dickinson would have been fully aware, that the sun is set and the other planets revolve around it. But now it's as if even the very laws of physics have been broken by death. This is the power that death has to change everything. And again, we see this use of caesura, and we see it more here than in any other quatrain. And this is also significant because this is the turning point of the entire poem, where she is finally reaching closer to that physical state of death. Then we finally come back to a place of ease, and we see that our rhythm has come back to its proper place. Again, I've bolded those stressed and unstressed for you. So we pause before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. And now I'm back to that comfortable rhythm, that comfortable place where I can begin to feel at ease. Then I turn to my metaphor of this house, and when we read through it that first time, we noted in our comprehension that this house was described in a very strange manner, and that is because this house is a metaphor for the grave. So just as when we are alive, we live in homes, our houses, when we die, our new home will be the grave. Hence why we have this intense use of imagery here to help us see that in fact she's talking about the ground, this swelling of the ground. So after you bury a coffin and you place the soil back on top of it, oftentimes you'll have this raising of the earth. And here talking about the roof of the house that's scarcely visible. If you talk about a roof of a house, it should be huge. So this is giving us the idea that this house she's describing is small, and that the roof has this cornice above it, so this ornamental design. But where is the roof? In the ground. This is how we know that this is a metaphor for her tombstone, right? When you have a roof in architecture, you don't place it on the ground, you place it at the very top. So again, all of these being used to create this image of the grave. And then finally, that continued use of caesura, those pauses, to remind us that this ride is a slow one. Finally, then, I come to my last quatrain, and I see that my rhythm continues to repeat itself. I still have that slanted rhyme scheme, so that emphasis on eternity. And I see this metaphor continuing. So I see in this portion of the quatrain that Dickinson is talking about the moment she first realized that she was heading towards death. And that was when she first surmised or saw the horses' heads. And this should be interesting for us because these horses' heads are going to be representative of that journey into death, right? Just as you would have a horse-drawn carriage taking away someone's coffin to their burial site, similar as we would have hearses today driving the coffin to their burial site. Here we see from the very beginning of the poem, Dickinson has this frontal view of the carriage arriving. She's not looking at it as it passes her by, it's coming towards her. So she would have seen these horses' heads from the very beginning of the poem. So it's interesting, right? The comment that she's making about death. That death is a slow ride. It's a gentle one. And although it could catch us unaware, right? She's not properly dressed. We all know it's coming. We all have this concept of being mortal and one day having to deal with death. And this is the image that she's created. She's telling this story, and it's as if it happened yesterday. Although for her, she states that this happened centuries ago, hundreds of years ago. But it's still as if it happened only yesterday for her. And then finally, again, closing with that continued use of caesura, those pauses to better reflect on death. So we've gone through the entire analysis of the poem. This one in particular is extremely rich with literary devices, so it took a little bit longer. But we clearly understand that the topic being discussed is death, and that we have several themes we can derive from it, one of them being the inevitability of death, that we all see death coming, but also that we should welcome death rather than fear it. We know that because Dickinson never describes death as this dark, foreboding figure, but rather as someone who's poised, who's a gentleman. And we saw that through the several instances of literary devices used. And two of the most impactful ones we need to focus on is rhythm and rhyme scheme. And that's particularly important because of her rebellious shift away from that set rhyme scheme and set rhythm in that fourth stanza. Again, we see that death is personified throughout the poem, and this is insanely important to understand. If we don't know that she's treating death as a person, the entire extended metaphor of life being a journey to death won't make sense. Some other analytical takeaways I understand is the use of metaphor and symbolism to help better place me as the reader into this journey with my speaker. So I understand, if I'm reading carefully throughout the entire poem, that death is very present, although present just under the surface. Hence the use of metaphor or symbolism to point to these things vaguely. And then finally, that use of caesura, or that extended pause, to give a slower feeling to the poem. So I go on this journey slowly with my reader, with my speaker, rather. Okay, that's it for video number 9. In video number 10, we will continue our discussion on perspectives of death by looking at the poem Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night by Dylan Thomas. Again, we're going to look at the topic and then the theme, and how Thomas makes use of literary devices to give the audience his perspective on death. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.